I've been a doctor long enough to know that hospitals are full of secrets. Narratives that were whispered at the nursing station or during a brief cup of coffee while working a midnight shift, but I never imagined that I would join on the hospital floor, where I worked the night shift. It was just another typical night. Things had been slow with I had witnessed many long nights in critical care with very little tolerance, and when it was quiet, I generally welcomed it. I was on my way to see how Mr. Peterson, an old patient of mine, was doing. He had been in a coma for he was stable for about 2 weeks, but there wasn't much optimism that he would get well. Among those instances where the personnel had readied themselves for the situation and the family had bid farewell, naturally, everything had gone smoothly when I checked his vitals earlier that evening. Even still, I kept getting the impression that tonight was different, and as I got closer to his room, I saw something strangely. The air was filled with the soft hum of monitors, but the typical, everyday noises. I slowed my pace and concentrated because I heard an odd undertone that sounded almost like a whisper or faint murmur coming from down the hall. I tried to hear any real words, but as soon as I stopped, it disappeared, so I brushed it off as my imagination, and I proceeded to Mr. Peterson's room, mentally reviewing his record to maintain my concentration. Silently pushed open the door and entered, and to my amazement, Mr. Peterson was awake and lay there, gazing up at the ceiling, his eyes blurry and dull from his extended for someone who had been in a coma for so long, state appeared to retain a glimmer of awareness now. I answered, attempting to maintain a calm tone, "I'm shocked to see him awake, Mr. Peterson." He turned his head slowly to face me, and for a brief moment, as if some lucidity had come over him, I wasn't sure if he recognized me. He nodded, and the faintest trace of a movement was heard as he muttered, "She's leaving us tonight." "Who's leaving, Mr. Peterson?" He glanced over my shoulder, his gaze fixed on something above me. I fought the need to turn back as a chill ran down my spine, yet his demeanor was almost serene. Calm, as though he were whispering to me a private secret. "She's waiting." I had observed instances of patients suffering bewilderment, but I wasn't sure how to react when his gaze drifted back to the ceiling. Or hallucinations after emerging from a coma, but his tone was different. I was able to recover my assurance since it seemed more like he was articulating a fact than slipping into a hallucination. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't stop thinking about what he said, so I quickly made a notation in his chart. I blamed it on the consequences of his illness, but the word "she's leaving us" kept repeating in my head. I gave him his medication tonight and checked his vitals while attempting to ignore the persistent sense that as I turned to go, Mr. Peterson murmured once more that something was amiss. "She's here," soft as a wind, and I turned to face him. His large, unblinking eyes were fixed on the entrance, and I followed his gaze in the hopes of seeing someone standing there. I asked, attempting to sound cool, "Who's here, Mr. Peterson?" But the entryway was vacant. I stepped closer in the hopes of catching him staring at the door. Him from whatever condition he was in, but his face remained the same. Gazing into the deserted corridor as though there were something or someone standing just outside the threshold, experiencing a knot in my gut, I retreated from the room, giving him one final glance before shutting his comments stuck in my head as I walked down the corridor back to the I tried to decompress when I arrived at the nurse's station and saw Linda, the chief nurse, creating charts for the upcoming shift. But I felt compelled to tell Linda about what I had just gone through, so I did. She glanced at me and asked, "Do you know anything about Mr. Peterson? Has he ever been lucid?" Scowling a little, "No, he hasn't responded since being admitted, so why he was only awake when he muttered something odd about her expression, but he was hesitant to sound too dramatic. It was odd how he informed me that someone was leaving us, and I felt a glimmer of intrigue mingled with uneasiness. Tonight, he remarked, "She's here." He continued to stare at the entrance as if he saw Linda standing there. "You're not the first to remark it." Her face puffed a little as she turned to face Mr. Peterson's chamber down the hall. I leaned in to hear her say, "What do you mean?" "There have been rumors among the night staff that occasionally they will say similar things at the end, as if they detect something that the rest of us are unable to perceive." I felt cold while I waited for them because I had heard stories of patients having there was a weight to her images, but I had always written them off as hallucinations or the side effects of medicine. Has anyone else on this floor said anything with such earnestness that it was difficult to dismiss? Recently brought it up. Linda glanced down the hall once more, her face inscrutable. The woman in room 217 informed one of the nurses that she had passed away last night. The corridor was empty when they checked, but someone had come to see her. The idea of another patient witnessing the same thing made me shiver even though I hadn't been on duty the night before. Made me feel uneasy. Could it really be a coincidence that was attempting to? I went around checking on the other patients to get rid of the eerie feeling, but as the hours passed, I couldn't shake the persistent feeling that I was being watched whenever I passed a dark room or a room that was empty. I sensed an invisible presence in the corner, like though someone was hovering just outside of. I heard a gentle beep from one of the monitors down the hall as I made my way back to the nurse's station. At 3:12 a.m., I checked my watch. Only a skeleton crew remained to run the floor after the majority of the workers left for home. I returned to the deserted corridor, which was silent and dimly lit, with every footfall echoing in the distance. Mr. Peterson's room to see how he was doing again. He had been in a coma for weeks, and following his abrupt statement that she was leaving as I walked into the room tonight, I couldn't get rid of the unsettling feeling that something odd was happening. Discovered that Mr. Peterson was awake and not dazed or disoriented. But for the first time since being advised to do so, he was sitting up, completely cognizant, and his eyes were filled with light. He glanced at me while the nurse at his bedside gently arranged his pillows and checked his IVs. "Mr. Peterson, you're awake." I stumbled, trying to hide my surprise as best I could. He appeared totally relaxed, as if he had just returned from a short yet peaceful nap. He laughed as he added, "Coma woke and feeling quite good, doctor." "The nurse is here." I glanced at the nurse, who nodded, verifying that everything had been examined and modified. "I know how to take care of you." It was standard procedure for her to ensure his comfort, but something about this entire circumstance felt anything but ordinary to me. I inquired, "How are you feeling, Mr. Peterson?" Surprised at how quickly he recovered, saying, "I feel like I've been asleep for ages," yet he paused, "It feels like I'm waking up, and everything feels normal." It took me a moment to reply, "But I'm just happy to see that you're staring at my face and asking if something's wrong. You're awake, but do you recall anything about Mr. Peterson's frown earlier tonight?" "I'm not sure." "Do you recall why I paused before pressing on? You mentioned to me that someone was leaving us tonight." He shook his head, appearing truly perplexed. "Doctor, I don't remember anything like that," I said. "He might have been entering and exiting consciousness, possibly whispering unintelligible things to me. Sensed to him now that he was completely conscious, but the memory of his voice was still quite distinct. And certain kept coming back to me." The remainder of the night went smoothly, and a few hours later I went back to my rounds, and when I visited Mr. Peterson's room once more, he appeared to be sleeping peacefully. I was paged at 5 in the morning, as anyone who had just woken up from weeks of slumber could be. An ICU nurse reported that a patient, a lady in her late 40s, had died in the early hours of the morning. Been dealing with a complex set of health problems for months, and as I read over the notes in her chart, my eyes strayed. The connection struck me as I was walking down the hall towards Mr. Peterson's room, which was only one door over from the deceased woman's. "She's leaving us tonight." Shock. Had Mr. Peterson sensed what was happening to take place in the adjacent room, and upon her death, an odd sense of calm descended along that corridor. Sensation that persisted even as the hospital started to wake up with the doctors, nurses, and patients. I felt a weight that I couldn't quite describe, like if something significant had happened in something more profound than the mind could comprehend. In those still hours of the night I never discussed the encounter with Mr. Peterson once again, and when he was released a few days later, neither did he. He appeared to be as lucid and as sharp-headed as anyone could be, making no further reference to his peculiar addiction, but I still think about that night every time I pass that room. Given the words he had uttered prior to fully awakening, was it really a coincidence, or was there something more profound that neither of us can ever truly comprehend? I'll never be certain, but it's a part of me. I wonder whether Mr. Peterson saw something in those liminal areas between consciousness and the unknowable. Couldn't see anything concealed in the calm hours of the day, waiting just beyond the door. The clean environment of night hospitals has a way of playing tricks on your head. The buzzing atmosphere is unsettling on its own, but it changes when darkness descends into something completely new, a silent, reverberating space that seems far too empty and discomforting. I had been admitted for a small operation that wasn't life-threatening, but they wanted me to be monitored for it during a few days that were meant to be normal. My room was hidden at the end of a lengthy hallway, away from the it initially seemed serene because it was far from the nurse's station and in a busier neighborhood, but as on my second night, the hours passed until solitude began to feel more like abandonment. I had been slipping in and out of sleep, that fuzzy half-awake state where the unease really began to set in. Shadows appeared deeper and noises seemed louder than they should have been. I heard footsteps in the hallway, which wasn't out of the ordinary for a hospital at night, but they seemed strange because they were dragging slowly and pausing a lot. I assumed it was a nurse checking on patients with a quiet kind in between each step. The diligence they employ when making nighttime rounds so as not to wake anyone. I rolled over in bed, attempting to block out the noise and go back asleep, but the footsteps didn't stop. I waited for a moment outside my door, expecting to hear a faint knock or the sound of the door opening, but there was only silence, and the more I listened to it, the more unnerving it becomes. I checked the time at 3:07 a.m. and noticed that the person outside my door was motionless and silent. I was starting to tell myself that I was just dreaming it all or overanalyzing everything. But then I noticed a shadow spread. It wasn't a trick of the light, this shadow was visible across the tiny bit of light that came in from beneath the door. It was distinct and had a human-like shape, but it didn't move like a person's shadow. Instead, it remained in place. Very still, as if someone were standing directly outside my door. Sitting up in bed, I watched as my heart rate increased, but I continued to adhere to logical justifications. Perhaps the nurse on the phone had moved temporarily away from my door, but as I gazed, the shadow remained fixed. Tried to listen for even the smallest sound, but nothing could be heard. After a short while, the shadow in the morning, I persuaded myself that it had been a fiction of my imagination as it seemed to vanish back into the darkness. I reasoned that you could be tricked by hospitals and medications. When the nurse arrived to check my vitals, I mentioned it in passing, almost laughing it off, but she didn't seem amused. "You noticed a shadow in the corridor?" and she questioned in a tense voice, perhaps one of the night staff members. "Rounds." Her response felt forced and scripted, leaving a weird impression, and I attempted to ignore my instincts and remained distracted for the remainder of the day. When the lights went down that evening, I was unable to completely unwind, and the anxiety reappeared. Dreaded the idea of seeing that shadow once more as they watched the hallway with tired eyes as midnight passed. Everything was quiet for a while, but at 3:02 a.m. that's what woke me up. I lay motionless, tensing all over as I listened to the slow, dragging footsteps. I braced myself knowing what I would see when footsteps stopped at my door once more, and sure enough, the shadow reappeared. However, the air felt heavy this time, as if it were pressing against the crevice beneath the door. Couldn't take their eyes off the shadow, wondering what or who was there and why they weren't moving or entering. Abruptly, the shadow changed as if the person or object had shifted positions, then swiftly vanished into the shadows once more, exiting the corridor. Silence, but the following morning I saw an elderly guy named Mr. Wills conversing with a nurse across the hall. Couldn't hear the majority of what they were saying, but one line in particular made my heart skip a beat. The shadow he had also seen it in the corridor, so I knew it wasn't my imagination. At night, there was a genuine presence in the corridor that only surfaced at the dead of night. I felt a chill come over me as I glanced back at my door, fearing the fact that everyone else was asleep. Imagine spending another evening in that room, and when the nurse arrived to see how I was doing, I told her what Mr. Wills had said in the hopes she might explain things to me logically, but her face changed. And she promptly brushed it off, claiming that Mr. Wilkes was heavily medicated and frequently experienced hallucinations. However, the way she averted her gaze gave me the impression that there was more to it than she wanted to talk about. How I stayed up that night, determined to catch the shadow if it returned, and kept my bedside. Hours went by, and I finally fell asleep, thinking that the light would be sufficient to keep whatever it was at bay. Off my worry being overtaken by my fatigue, but at exactly 3 a.m. I was startled. The room was quiet when I woke up, but I felt like I was being watched because the hairs on the back of my neck sprang up. With my heart racing, I turned to face the door, and once more, the shadow was more distinct and dark than before. Prior to being shoved against my door's little crack, it appeared to be slightly open. I couldn't take my eyes off it, watching with sick fascination as it seemed eager, almost as if it was trying to get in. Started to glide slowly down the hallway until stopping at Mr. Will's door. After lingering there for a while, the shadow horribly moved through his locked door. I vanished into his chamber, lying there too scared to move, and listening for any. There was no indication of what was going on across the hall, only a deafening silence that seemed to be. I barely slept the rest of the night because my mind was racing with fear. Following inquiries in the morning, I discovered that Mr. Wills had died overnight. The nurses claimed that he had passed away quietly and that it was just his time, but I couldn't get rid of the impression that the shadow was involved since I was aware of what I had witnessed and knew it wasn't by chance. Later that day, I heard two nurses whispering to each other outside one of them whispered in the room, and it's always around 3 in the morning. I'm not sure what it is, but the patients at the end of the corridor sent a chill down my spine. And it wasn't just a light trick or a drug side effect. I was next in queue for something that only emerged in the middle of the night from the hospital. My body was rigid with anxiety as I lay awake at night, knowing that it would come for me the same way it had for Mr. Wills. I watched as the minutes passed closer to 3 in the morning, my heart began to race. I wanted to get out of the room and run. Should never turn around, but as the clock struck 3 in the morning, I was too scared to move. The darkness slid back into view, darker and more distinct than before. Crawling towards my door from across the hallway floor, and since I knew there was no way out, I held my breath and watched as if testing the barrier in search of a way, the shadow pressed against my door's little opening. Its icy presence filled the room with a sense of dread, and I could feel it. For what seemed like hours, the shadow hovered outside my door, so intense that it was oppressive, and then it vanished as abruptly as it had appeared, leaving only quiet in its. I was released from the hospital the following morning, and I departed as soon as I could since I was relieved to be out of there. However, I still can't get rid of the image of that shadow waiting in the corridor, and occasionally I question whether it's still there, anticipating its next move. I've been a night nurse for years, victim. You see things, you grow accustomed to them, and then you become accustomed to things, if that makes sense, but occasionally something occurs that leaves a lasting impression. I don't consider myself superstitious, or I didn't till today, but it was a peaceful night shift, and I still can't get over the fact that it happened yesterday. An elderly man named Mr. Connor lived in room 216. He had been admitted following a significant stroke. And the doctors told him straight out that he was already in a coma when he arrived and that he probably wouldn't wake up again. In all honesty, he was simply breathing on his own, but very few would simply state that he was not living. I would visit his room most evenings to make sure his IV drip was working properly and to check his vitals. And possibly move his blankets. He was a regular during my shift, and I grew accustomed to the consistent the soft rhythm of his breathing, which became a part of my own habit, but there was something strange about him. I can't really describe his room, but I always had this weird vibe when it's difficult to describe, but occasionally it seemed like there was a weight in when I first entered one night, the air felt heavy and oppressive. It had to have been about 2 in the morning. I recalled that the corridors were deserted and completely silent as I was going about my daily business. Hospitals are generally frigid, but that night it was bone-chilling. It didn't seem to matter that I was wrapped up in my jumper while I was chilling. I recall that my hands were trembling from the cold as I approached room 216, and when I entered Mr. Connor's room, the chill hit me more forcefully. I shuddered when I entered a freezer and tightened my jumper, telling myself that was only the air conditioning. I attempted to concentrate on my work by monitoring the monitors and checking his vitals, but I was unable to disregard the tingling sensation at the nape of my neck. You are aware of the sensation that occurs when you simply know someone's. I tried to push it away, but it felt precisely like that while I was watching you. In the midst of my shift, I leaned over Mr. to begin envisioning when I went to check Connor's for. I observed that his respiration was so weak that I had to lean in to make sure I was viewing everything correctly when he suddenly moved, and I swear my heart just about stopped. One moment he was lying still, and the next he was sitting up and looking directly at me. Wasn't gradual, rather, it seemed as though he suddenly sprung to life, his eyes wide open and staring directly into mine. I felt as though I was staring at a ghost since I was immobile and unable to breathe, and then he murmured in a hoarse whisper, "He's coming for me," and those words were almost audible. I attempted to find out what he meant to ask him, as well as who he was referring to, but before he closed his eyes and collapsed back onto the bed as soon as I could say anything, and his breathing stopped. Returned to that slow, shallow rhythm, and I stood there motionless, trying to make sense, as if he hadn't moved at all. Of what I had just witnessed, my thoughts were racing, and I experienced a surge of anxiety and perplexity. I reasoned that it must have been some sort of reflex, perhaps it was a final surge of energy, as people say. Sometimes, though, I couldn't stop hearing his voice and couldn't shake his words. "He's coming for me," he said. I left the room with a heaviness in my chest, as if he was certain of it and had been waiting for this time. Hoped the other nurses wouldn't notice my trembling as I made my way back to the nurses' station, but I suppose they did. One of them asked whether I was okay, and I nodded in an attempt to explain why I appeared a little pale. To dismiss it, claiming that I was simply exhausted from the cold, but in reality, I couldn't stop thinking about it. After a few minutes, I had myself return to see how he was doing. I told myself I was being absurd in saying that I had to move on from it because it was only a strange time. However, when I entered his room's door and saw that his bed was empty, I initially believed that perhaps I checked the sheets and they were still warm, but I suspected that they had transferred him for some sort of late-night exam. I hurried back to the nurse's station, trying not to panic, and asked, "Did someone move Mr.?" If he had only been there a minute earlier. Connor gave me a perplexed look. "What are you talking about?" one of them inquired, and I could see the bewilderment in her eyes. "Mr. Connor's gone," I answered, attempting to remain composed, but I started to feel panicked, and they all looked at me as if I were insane. We searched every room, including the floor, stairwells and supply closets, but he was nowhere to be found. It seemed as though he had disappeared into thin air. The more as I looked farther, I began to feel the same chill seeping over me, one that went straight to my bones. I couldn't stop thinking about his words. "He's coming for me at last." One of the nurses recommended that we view the security footage, so we all gathered around the monitor and watched when the security guy played back the video from that evening, we noticed Mr. Connor lying in bed, exactly as I had left him, and suddenly a tall man wearing dark clothing emerged at the door. Moved so fluidly that it seemed as though he was gliding as his garments glided into the room, and he approached the bed without. After a brief moment of hesitation, he reached down and carefully took Mr. Connors out of bed and placed him in a wheelchair. Kim with him, and we noticed that his motions were unsettling, as if he was too calm or professional. He wheeled Mr. Connor out of the room and out of sight down the deserted hallway. Nobody saw that he failed to set off any alarms or pass any nurses. He appeared to have planned everything out to the last detail, even calling the police, as if he understood precisely what he was doing. They asked us all questions right away, attempting to understand how someone could simply stroll in and grab a patient without anyone noticing, yet we were all as astonished by the video as they were, and we had no answers. Shown everything, but after they left the premises, they were nowhere to be found for days. The police continued searching and contacting us with inquiries about any sign of Mr. Connor or the person who had stolen him, but it seemed as though they vanished into thin air, and I couldn't stop thinking about what he had said. It seemed as if he knew this was going to happen, but how could that be? He's coming for me. Eventually, a week or so later, the cops discovered them and located It turns out that the individual in the video, who was identified as Mr. Connor's son, had created I suppose he had a lifelong fear of hospitals since he had promised his kid years ago that he wouldn't allow him to pass away there. Like the folks who always claim that these are places where people go to die, his son had a pact that they had made. They discovered them both in an old farmhouse a few towns away, and Mr. Connor was there to fulfill that promise. He was frail and could hardly sit up, but he refused to return to the hospital, and 2 weeks later, he and his son died. Despite the tragedy of the event, I couldn't get the picture of him sitting by his side as he had requested. "He's coming for me," he said, looking directly at me from that hospital bed. As if he had known everything. It's already unnerving to work hospital security at night, but when unusual things happen, it gets really intense. Assume the position, believing it would be easy to keep the halls safe, make a couple rounds per shift, and ensure that no one was entering the hospital covertly, but the truth was something I hadn't as anticipated. Hospitals have a spooky, frightening stillness at night that lingers. I convinced myself it was all a trick of my imagination. That, given the age of the building, the stairway lights and the air conditioner's continuous hum were usual. Would have its peculiarities, but I was being paid to keep watch and disregard those young people. Disruptions, that is, until one specific shift down by the morgue. I had never liked being close to the morgue. If I'm to be honest, I had made every effort to stay away from it, but on Wednesday night I was given the basement level, so I had to sweep the area every hour to check the locks on the doors. And ensuring everything was safe. The hospital had fewer patients that evening than usual. Significantly fewer guests, just a few employees pacing the hallways on various floors in an attempt to finish their changes at approximately 11 o'clock p.m. The unusually cool basement indicates that hospitals are constantly cold, but this one felt unique, like a bone chill that made you feel. As I saw a slight flicker of light at the end of the tunnel, like if you were walking directly into a freezer. Thinking it was likely just another broken light bulb in the hallway leading to the morgue. Although I first didn't give it much thought, I nevertheless included it to my list of concerns to report. The lights appeared to flicker once more as I got closer to the morgue entrance. Time seemed to be pulsing in time with my footfall, so I forced myself to remain composed in order to intensify the eerie sensation. The morgue is basically a room with flashing lights, and my thoughts kept going in this direction while I tried to keep. I was just going about my work as usual, but as I passed the front door I thought I heard a faint, unclear noise, almost like someone, but I couldn't quite make it out. I stopped listening and whispered, but the only sound I could hear was the air vents whirring. I told myself to keep it together as I continued to move, but as I was about to take a few steps forward, I heard it once more. A faint, low voice could be heard whispering, "Derek." I froze, thinking that maybe it was simply the wind blowing through the ventilation or that my imagination was playing tricks. System or a far-off echo of a discussion from a different floor, but it hadn't sounded that way. Regardless matter who shouted my name, I either tried to ignore it or shook it off. After all, the hospital was merely a large, deserted structure at night, so it's easy to imagine things. But the voice returned, and this I couldn't dismiss it at the time since it was so obvious and unambiguous. "Derek," I inhaled deeply and told myself that I was the security guard. Have to inspect it to make sure nobody was trespassing, breaking any laws, or doing anything they shouldn't. I have moved more slowly to the door and slightly opened it. Furthermore, although the interior light was poor, it was sufficient to show that the room was empty. However, as when the voice grew louder and closer to Derek as I turned to go, my breath caught in my. This time, it was obvious, I wasn't dreaming, someone was calling my name and begging against all of my instincts. Yelling at me to get out, I moved deeper into the space, looking around at the shadows, my heart pounding as I took in every surface and nook was in its proper position, and the tables were empty. Drawers were closed, and the surrounding quiet was as dense as the walls, but as I stood there, I heard another faint, repetitive tapping sound that sounded like fingers yet was steady and persistent, reverberated around the room. I pointed my torch in the direction of the sound coming from my palms tapping against the metal drawers. I grabbed it tightly, quivering, expecting to see anything, but once more, nothing was there. I felt something chilly and extremely frigid press against my back as I was ready to turn around and go. It felt like a cold breath had been expelled against my neck. I frantically spun around with my torch, looking around the room, but nothing was. I should have been alone, but while I stood there attempting to control my breathing, the tapping resumed. My heart was pounding and my entire body was screaming for me to leave as it came from the far end of the room, yet I felt as like something was holding me there, as if I was supposed to hear it. I was stuck there and couldn't move. Listen to comprehend that I was already tense and that the room went silent. Everything felt much more intense in solitude, so I turned to go when I heard there's a light shuffling sound coming from someplace down the hall, getting louder like someone moving slowly down the hallway. My initial reaction was to dismiss it as a caretaker or another worker on the night shift, but something about those footsteps felt incorrect. They moved steadily and slowly, almost hesitatingly, each one approaching the morgue room. They bounced around me and reverberated off the tiled walls, making it impossible to determine their precise origin, and I then recognized the footsteps as I tried to hear them coming directly at me in the hopes that they would turn off. Instead of waiting to see who or what it was, they continued to move closer, so I grabbed my flashlight, and as I went for the doorknob, I heard only a few footfall and turned back towards the doorway, my pulse pounding. Just a few steps away, and outside the door, I yanked after barely turning the knob. It opened and rushed into the hallway. Once there, I didn't turn around and continued to move quickly without pausing. Only when I arrived at the light and heard it did I leave that corridor and return to the safety of the main floor. I stopped as I heard the usual nighttime sounds of the hospital, catching my that night. I came to the realization that there was more in the hospital's silence than I had previously thought, and whatever was down when I eventually calmed down, I didn't plan to discover out there in the morgue. Tried to make sense of what I had heard and seen. Perhaps the stress of the night shift was just playing games on my mind, affecting me, but I knew in my heart it wasn't true. I hadn't imagined the voice, the chill that someone or something had been there with me, desperate and confined. And after that night I managed to avoid the morgue as much as possible, asking for jobs that kept me out of the basement, yet occasionally I would hear tales from other guards about whispers, unusual sounds, and lights that flicker periodically. The last time I heard that voice screaming my name, I would get that same cold. I made fast rounds while keeping my head down and my footsteps light when I was assigned to the basement, not daring to maybe it was a lost soul. But I'm not sure what was in that morgue that night. A spirit caught between worlds pleading with someone to listen to it, or perhaps the structure itself was the source of the lingering echoes of lives and deaths that had passed through its walls. I'm hoping that someone would remember that. All I know is that I haven't been in that morgue since that night, and every time I walk past, I can't get rid of the impression that someone is waiting and watching. If these stories made you tense for another opportunity to whisper my name, click like and subscribe to receive more eerie encounters, and turn on notifications because you won't want to miss what's next. Be cautious, be mindful, and occasionally remember you should be most afraid of what you don't see in the hospital. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.